Just don't tell the neighbors you're my mother." No one moved for a second. The words landed so quietly that for a moment no one in the room moved. The front door was still open behind me, letting in the mild Connecticut afternoon air, and somewhere outside a dog barked twice before everything went still again. Ryan stood a few steps away in the hallway, one hand resting awkwardly against the wall as if he'd already said too much. His voice hadn't been loud. In fact, it had been almost careful. Careful in the way people are when they think they're being reasonable. But the sentence itself hung in the air like something fragile and ugly. Across the room, Melissa had frozen near the kitchen counter with a wine glass halfway to her lips. For a second, she looked at Ryan, then at me as though trying to judge how serious the moment really was. Neither of us spoke. From outside came the faint sound of two women chatting near the driveway neighbors, I assumed. Ryan glanced toward the open door as if he was suddenly aware they might hear. Then he lowered his voice even further. "Just for today," he added. "It's easier if people think you're visiting." I looked at him. Not with anger, not even with surprise. Just a quiet, steady look that made him shift his weight slightly where he stood. I set my overnight bag down beside the entry table. My fingers lingered on the handle for a moment before I straightened. "Of course," I said softly. Ryan nodded quickly, relieved by how easy that had been. Melissa gave a small smile that never quite reached her eyes. Neither of them noticed the way I glanced around the house. The wide windows, the pale hardwood floors, the tall white cabinets in the kitchen. Every detail looked exactly the way I remembered from the photographs Ryan had sent months earlier. Except now, standing inside it, the place felt strangely unfamiliar. What Ryan didn't realize, what neither of them realized, was that the story of this house was a little more complicated than the one they had been telling everyone. But that part would come later. For now, I simply stepped inside and closed the door. My name is Barbara Collins, and I'm 63 years old. A few hours earlier, my flight from Oregon had landed at JFK just before noon. Ryan had insisted on picking me up himself, which I had taken as a good sign. We hadn't seen each other in nearly a year, and I thought perhaps this visit would give us a chance to spend some real time together. The drive from the airport to Greenwich had been pleasant enough. Ryan talked about work, about the neighborhood, about how the community here was very social. Melissa had chimed in occasionally from the passenger seat, describing the summer block parties and weekend gatherings the street hosted. They sounded proud of it. I listened quietly from the back seat, watching the houses grow larger and farther apart as we left the highway behind. When we finally turned onto their street, I understood why. The neighborhood was beautiful, wide lawns, tall trees, homes that looked polished and carefully maintained. The kind of place where people waved politely to each other while walking their dogs in the evening. Ryan parked in the driveway and glanced back at me with a smile. "Pretty nice, right?" "It's lovely," I said. And it was. But something about the way Melissa immediately started adjusting the cushions on the front porch bench when we got out of the car made me think appearances mattered here more than comfort. Inside the house, Ryan had given me a quick tour. Living room, kitchen, guest room upstairs where I'd be staying. Everything looked tidy. Almost too tidy. What struck me most, though, was something smaller. On the walls of the hallway were several framed photographs Ryan and Melissa at the beach. Ryan with colleagues at what looked like a company dinner, Melissa with a group of women holding champagne glasses at some kind of event. But nowhere, not in the hallway, not in the living room, not on the shelves, did I see a single photograph of Ryan as a child, or of our family. I didn't mention it. Instead, I set my coat over the back of a chair and walked slowly through the living room while Ryan disappeared into the kitchen to grab drinks. Melissa followed me a moment later. "You must be tired after the flight," she said politely. "A little." She nodded toward the window. "The neighbors are very friendly here," she added. "They're always stopping by to say hello." As if on cue, the doorbell rang. Ryan appeared instantly, almost as though he'd been expecting it. "Ah, that'll be the Whitakers," he said brightly. Melissa smoothed her hair and moved toward the door. Ryan glanced back at me for a split second, and that was when he had said it. Just quietly, almost casually. "Just don't tell the neighbors you're my mother." Now the door swung open. Two women stepped inside, laughing lightly as Melissa greeted them. Ryan slipped easily into conversation, introducing everyone with the smooth confidence of someone who had practiced this kind of moment many times before. "And this," he said, after a moment, gesturing toward me with an easy smile, "is Barbara, an old family friend who's visiting for a few days." The two women smiled warmly at me. "Welcome to the neighborhood," one of them said. I returned the smile. But standing there in the middle of that spotless living room listening to Ryan talk about weekend barbecues and community events, I realized something quietly important. In the story my son was telling the world about his life here, I didn't exist. The Whitakers didn't stay long. They chatted with Melissa about the upcoming neighborhood barbecue, admired the new hydrangeas in the front yard, and complimented the kitchen renovation Ryan proudly pointed out behind them. Their conversation moved easily, the kind of polite rhythm people adopt when they've had the same small talk with each other many times before. I stood near the edge of the living room smiling when someone looked my way, and nodding occasionally but mostly observing. It was something I'd learned to do well over the years, listen more than speak. At one point Melissa poured everyone a glass of wine. When she handed one to me, she said brightly, "Barbara's just visiting from Oregon for a few days." The sentence floated past as casually as Ryan's introduction had earlier. Just visiting, not his mother. One of the Whitaker women tilted her head toward me with friendly curiosity. "Oregon must be beautiful this time of year." "It is," I said gently. No one asked anything else. Ryan quickly shifted the conversation back to the neighborhood, explaining how the community organized summer events and how lucky they felt to have found this house. I noticed the way he said this house. Pride, ownership. The women nodded approvingly. "Well, you two have done a wonderful job with it," one of them said. Ryan beamed. Melissa laughed softly and added, "Ryan worked so hard to make everything perfect." I took a slow sip of wine and let the moment pass. The visit ended soon after that. The Whitakers said their goodbyes and stepped back out into the mild afternoon sunlight, promising to see Ryan and Melissa at the barbecue the following weekend. When the door closed behind them, the house fell quiet again. Ryan stretched his arms briefly, as if shaking off the tension of hosting. "Nice people," he said. "They seem lovely," I replied. Melissa carried the empty glasses into the kitchen without looking at me. Ryan glanced toward the staircase. "You should get some rest if you're tired," he said. "The guest room's ready upstairs." I thanked him and picked up my overnight bag. The guest room was bright and comfortable with a large window overlooking the backyard. Someone had placed fresh towels on the bed and a small vase of white flowers on the dresser. Melissa had clearly taken time preparing it. Still, something about the room felt strangely temporary, like a hotel someone might stay in for a night or two, rather than a place meant for family. I unpacked slowly, hanging my coat in the closet and placing a few personal items on the nightstand. Then I sat down on the edge of the bed and listened to the faint sounds drifting up from downstairs. Ryan and Melissa talking quietly in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator, a cabinet door closing. For a long moment I stayed there, staring out the window at the neat backyard and the tall trees lining the fence. Then I stood up again. Curiosity is a subtle thing. It doesn't always arrive as suspicion. Sometimes it's simply a quiet awareness that something doesn't quite fit. I stepped back into the hallway and moved slowly toward the staircase. The house had settled into a peaceful afternoon stillness. Ryan and Melissa were outside now. I could hear the sliding patio door open and their voices drifting faintly from the yard. That gave me a moment alone. I walked through the living room again, noticing details I hadn't paid attention to earlier. A shelf filled with decorative books, 2 framed wedding photographs of Ryan and Melissa, a polished wooden console table near the entryway, but still no childhood pictures, no graduation photos, no family holidays, nothing that connected Ryan's life now with the life he'd lived before this house. I moved into the kitchen. The counters were spotless, the cabinets perfectly aligned. Melissa clearly kept everything in careful order. Near the laundry room door, a narrow desk had been built into the wall, an organized space for bills and paperwork. A small stack of envelopes rested neatly in one corner. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, but as I passed the desk, a familiar word caught my eye on the top document. Property. I paused. The folder beneath the envelope was partially open, revealing a few printed pages clipped together. For a moment I simply stood there. Then, almost absent-mindedly, I slid the folder out a little farther. The papers inside were official forms, records from the Greenwich Land Office, legal language signatures, dates. My eyes moved slowly down the first page. Property address, loan information, owner documentation, and then halfway down the page a name, not Ryan's, mine, Barbara Collins. I stared at the document for a long second, the faint sound of Ryan's laughter drifting in through the open patio door. The folder slipped back into place beneath my fingers. Outside, Ryan and Melissa continued talking casually in the backyard, unaware of the quiet realization forming in the kitchen. Whatever story my son had been telling his neighbors about this house, the paperwork was telling a different one. For a long moment, I stood there in the quiet kitchen, staring at the name printed neatly across the page. Barbara Collins. For a second, I wondered if I had read it wrong. The letters looked unfamiliar on the official document, as if they belonged to someone else. Outside, Ryan's voice drifted faintly through the open patio door, followed by Melissa's soft laugh. They sounded relaxed, comfortable, two people enjoying a warm afternoon in a house they believed was entirely theirs. I gently slid the folder back into place. Then I walked to the sink and poured myself a glass of water, letting the coolness settle the sudden rush of thoughts moving through my mind. The truth was, none of this should have surprised me, because I remembered exactly how this house had entered Ryan's life. It had started almost 2 years earlier with a phone call. Ryan had sounded unusually excited that day. "Mom, I think we found it," he had said. The perfect place. At the time, he and Melissa had been living in a small apartment outside the city, saving money and scanning real estate listings every weekend. Ryan had talked often about wanting something bigger, somewhere they could build a future. A house, a real neighborhood, somewhere people knew each other. "This one's in Greenwich," he told me. "It's incredible. The schools are amazing, the neighborhood's beautiful. It's exactly what we've been looking for." I could hear the hope in his voice, the same hopeful excitement he'd had as a boy whenever he discovered something new. But then his tone shifted slightly. "The only problem is the down payment." I already knew what was coming. "How much?" I asked, gently. There was a brief pause. "A little more than we have saved." Ryan tried to sound casual about it, but I could hear the hesitation underneath. He hated asking for help. Even when he was younger, he'd always preferred to solve things on his own. I had told him then what any parent might say. "Let's look at the numbers together." A week later, he had flown out to Salem to visit me. We sat at my kitchen table for hours, reviewing paperwork, bank statements, mortgage estimates. Ryan explained everything carefully: interest rates, closing costs, property taxes. Melissa joined us later that afternoon, enthusiastic and hopeful, talking about the neighborhood's block parties and the charming streets lined with old trees. "This house could really change things for us," she said, and I believed her. Ryan had worked hard for years building his career. Helping him take this step didn't feel like a sacrifice. It felt like a natural extension of everything I'd always tried to do as a mother: support him when it mattered most. In the end, the numbers were simple. Ryan and Melissa had enough income to handle the mortgage payments. What they lacked was the down payment. That was the piece I provided, $265,000. The money represented years of careful saving. Some of it had come from selling the old house in Oregon after Ryan left for college, some from investments I had quietly managed over time. I never thought of it as giving something up. I thought of it as helping my son build something. Still, I had one request when we finalized the paperwork. "Your name can be on the mortgage," I told him calmly, "but my name stays on the property deed." Ryan looked up from the paperwork. "Why?" "Because this protects both of us," I explained. "If anything ever went wrong financially, the arrangement ensured the house remained secure." Ryan studied the documents for a long moment before nodding. "Okay." At the time, the agreement seemed simple, practical. But as the months passed, I began noticing small changes in the way Ryan talked about the house. At first, it was subtle: my place in Greenwich, our home. Then gradually the story shifted. When he described the house to friends or colleagues, the details became simpler. He had found the house. He had worked hard to buy it. He had built this life. I didn't correct him. Pride can be a delicate thing for a son, but once about 6 months after they moved in, Ryan and I had a quiet conversation about it. We were standing outside the house after dinner, the streetlights just beginning to glow along the sidewalk. "You know," I said lightly, "technically the paperwork still lists me as the property owner." Ryan gave a quick laugh. "Yeah, I know." But then he hesitated. "Mom, it's just easier if people think I handled everything myself." I looked at him. "Easier?" He rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly uncomfortable. "You know how it is," he said. "People respect you more when they think you built something on your own." I didn't answer immediately. Ryan met my eyes and spoke more quietly. "I just don't want people thinking I still rely on my mother." The sentence hadn't sounded cruel then, just honest. Now, standing alone in the quiet kitchen of that same house, I finally understood something. Ryan hadn't simply wanted independence. He had slowly begun rewriting the story, and somewhere along the way, I had been edited out of it. The next morning in Ryan's house began quietly. Sunlight spilled through the tall kitchen windows, casting long golden rectangles across the polished floor. Somewhere outside, a lawnmower hummed faintly down the street. The neighborhood felt peaceful in the careful, orderly way places like this often do. Melissa was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs. She stood at the counter arranging flowers into a glass vase, turning each stem slightly until the shape looked exactly right. "Good morning," she said brightly when she noticed me. "Good morning." Ryan was sitting at the island with a cup of coffee and his phone, scrolling through something while half listening to the conversation around him. Melissa placed the finished vase near the window and stepped back to admire it. "We're having a few neighbors over later this afternoon," she said casually. "Just a small gathering." Ryan nodded without looking up. "Nothing big," he added, "just people from the street." Melissa opened one of the cabinets and began pulling out serving plates. "Everyone likes to stop by and say hello when someone's visiting," she explained. "It's kind of a neighborhood tradition." Her tone was friendly, but there was a careful rhythm to the way she spoke, as though she had already rehearsed the afternoon in her mind. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat quietly at the table while the two of them moved around the kitchen preparing for the gathering. Melissa arranged snacks on a wooden tray. Ryan stepped outside to check the patio furniture. From time to time, Melissa glanced toward me, offering polite smiles, but our conversation never moved beyond small courtesies. By early afternoon, the house looked even more immaculate than it had the day before. Fresh flowers on the counter, candles arranged on the coffee table, music playing softly from a speaker near the living room window. Around 3 o'clock, the first knock came at the door. Ryan answered it with the easy confidence of someone completely comfortable in his role here. "Hey, Tom," he greeted warmly. A tall man stepped inside, followed by his wife. They carried a bottle of wine and immediately began complimenting the house. "Every time we come over here, it looks better," the woman said. Melissa laughed lightly. "We try." Within 20 minutes, the living room filled with people, neighbors drifting in through the door, exchanging greetings, laughing easily, as if they'd known one another for years. I stood near the edge of the room with a glass of iced tea, watching the scene unfold. Ryan moved confidently from group to group, telling stories about work and the neighborhood. Melissa floated through the room, making sure everyone had something to drink. Together, they looked perfectly at home here. At one point, a woman I hadn't met yet approached Ryan and gestured toward me. For a moment, the conversation in the living room drifted naturally around me. Two men near the fireplace were talking about property taxes. Someone laughed softly near the kitchen island. Melissa was pouring another glass of wine for one of the neighbors, her movements smooth and practiced. But slowly, almost inevitably, the attention of the room began to shift. It started with a simple glance. One of the women, tall, wearing a light blue sweater, looked toward me while Ryan was finishing a story about the neighborhood block party. Her eyes lingered for a second longer than casual curiosity usually allows. Then another neighbor followed her gaze, and another. People weren't staring exactly, but their attention circled quietly around the same unspoken question. Who was I? I noticed Ryan see it too. For a brief moment, his sentence slowed, his voice catching slightly in the middle of a word before continuing. He reached for his drink, buying himself half a second. Across the room, Melissa's eyes met his. Just a quick look. A small nod. Almost invisible to everyone else. But I saw it. The room grew subtly quieter as the woman stepped closer, smiling politely. And that was when she spoke. "Ryan," she said, smiling politely. "I don't think you've introduced us." Ryan turned and walked over. For a brief second, his eyes met mine. Then he smiled. "Oh, right," he said easily. "This is Barbara." He placed a casual hand on the back of the chair beside me. "She's an old family friend visiting from Oregon." The woman smiled warmly. "It's so nice to meet you." "Nice to meet you as well," I replied gently. The conversation moved on quickly. Ryan began explaining something about the upcoming block party, and the woman laughed at one of his jokes before drifting toward another group. I remained standing there for a moment longer, listening as the room filled again with easy chatter. Across the room, Melissa caught my eye and offered a quick, approving smile, as if everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. And perhaps it was. For them. I set my glass down quietly on the side table and walked toward the window, watching the sunlight fade slightly across the quiet street outside. Behind me, Ryan continued talking with the neighbors about the house. "Our place," he said at one point, gesturing around the room. "Our home here in Greenwich." No one questioned the story. Why would they? After all, it sounded perfectly believable. But standing there by the window, I felt something shift quietly inside me. Because the truth about this house, the legal truth, was still sitting neatly inside a folder in the kitchen desk. And Ryan clearly believed that story would never matter. Before the evening continued, I want to ask you something. If you were standing in that living room and heard someone introduce their own mother as a family friend, how would that feel? Tell me honestly in the comments. And if that moment surprised you too, take a second to leave a like on the video. The conversation behind me swelled again as more neighbors arrived. Ryan laughed at something someone said near the kitchen. Melissa refilled glasses and kept the music playing softly in the background. From the outside, everything looked perfect. But quietly, almost invisibly, the story Ryan had been telling the neighborhood about his life was beginning to feel fragile. And the more I watched the room around me, the more certain I became that sooner or later the truth about this house would have to surface. The gathering lasted until early evening. Neighbors drifted out gradually, offering polite goodbyes and promises to meet again at the next block event. Ryan walked them to the door, each time smiling easily, thanking them for coming. Melissa followed behind with practiced warmth, collecting empty glasses and stacking plates in the kitchen. From the outside, it had been a perfectly pleasant afternoon. No raised voices, no awkward confrontations. Just quiet conversation, laughter, and the subtle rewriting of a story I knew better than anyone else in that room. By the time the last neighbor left, the sky outside had begun to soften into evening. Ryan stretched his arms as he closed the front door. "That went well," he said with satisfaction. Melissa nodded, already carrying dishes toward the sink. "They love coming over here," she replied. Ryan glanced toward me then, almost as if remembering I was still part of the room. "Hope it wasn't too boring for you." "Not at all," I said calmly. And that was the truth. The afternoon had been very interesting. Later that night, the house grew quiet again. Ryan and Melissa went upstairs early, tired from hosting. I could hear the faint creak of footsteps above me, then the sound of a bedroom door closing. I waited another 20 minutes before stepping back into the kitchen. The house was still. Only the soft hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. I walked slowly to the small desk near the laundry room, the same place where I had seen the folder earlier that afternoon. For a moment, I simply stood there looking at it. Then I opened it. The documents were where I had left them. I slid the first page free and laid it on the desk beneath the overhead light. The legal language was dense, the kind that required careful reading rather than quick scanning. Property address, mortgage terms, loan information. My eyes moved slowly down the page until they reached the section that mattered most. Owner of record. Again, the name appeared clearly. Barbara Collins, the mortgage itself, however, was listed under Ryan's name. That arrangement had been intentional from the beginning. He carried the monthly responsibility while my ownership on the deed provided long-term protection for the property. It had seemed like the safest solution at the time. Now it felt like something else entirely, a quiet kind of leverage. I turned the page and continued reading. The documents confirmed what I already understood. The property had been recorded with the Greenwich Land Records Office exactly as we had agreed 2 years earlier. Nothing had changed. Ryan had never removed my name. Perhaps he assumed the paperwork didn't matter anymore, or perhaps he simply believed I would never use it. I rested my hands lightly on the edge of the desk. The house around me was peaceful, almost serene. Upstairs, Ryan and Melissa slept comfortably in the master bedroom. Outside, the neighborhood lights glowed softly along the quiet street. Everything about the scene suggested stability, but the legal reality of the house told a slightly different story. I took my phone from my pocket. For a moment, I hesitated. Then I opened the camera and positioned the document carefully beneath the desk lamp. The image on the screen sharpened as I adjusted the angle. The address, the legal wording, the line that listed Barbara Collins as property owner. I took the photograph, then another this time, capturing the page that included the official filing information from the Greenwich Land Records Office. The camera shutter made a faint clicking sound in the quiet kitchen. I lowered the phone and looked at the images for a moment. Clear enough, precise enough, evidence if anyone ever needed to see it. Next, I opened my email. The contact I searched for had been in my phone for many years. David Rosen, an estate attorney in Hartford who had handled several legal matters for me over the past decade, calm, methodical, and extremely careful with details, exactly the kind of lawyer you wanted when property and family were involved. I attached the photos to the message. For a moment, my fingers hovered above the keyboard. Then I began to type. David, I hope you're well. I'm currently visiting my son in Greenwich and reviewing the paperwork for a property we finalized 2 years ago. I'd appreciate your thoughts on something. I paused briefly before continuing. Attached are images of the current deed documentation. Could you confirm that the ownership structure remains exactly as filed with the county short? Neutral, nothing emotional. Then I pressed send. The email disappeared from the screen with a quiet whoosh. For a long moment, I remained there staring at the dark window above the sink. Ryan probably believed the events of the afternoon had gone exactly as planned. His neighbors had met a polite visiting family friend. The story he preferred had remained intact. But somewhere between that afternoon introduction and this quiet moment in the kitchen, something subtle had shifted. Because once a story begins to drift too far from the truth eventually finds its way back. And now, for the first time since I had arrived in Greenwich, someone else was quietly looking at the same paperwork I had just photographed. The reply from David Rosen arrived the next morning. I saw the notification while I was still upstairs in the guest room, sunlight slipping quietly through the curtains. For a moment, I simply sat on the edge of the bed, holding the phone in my hand before opening the message. David's emails were always brief and precise. Barbara, I reviewed the documents you sent. According to the county records, the property ownership structure remains unchanged. You are still listed as the legal owner of record. If you'd like, we can discuss the implications of that in more detail. I read the message twice. Nothing emotional, just confirmation. The paperwork was exactly what it appeared to be. Downstairs, I could hear Melissa moving through the kitchen cabinets and the faint sound of Ryan's voice drifting in from the backyard. They were already awake. I dressed and went downstairs. Ryan was standing near the island pouring coffee when I entered the kitchen. "Morning," he said casually. "Good morning." Melissa appeared a moment later carrying a stack of folded towels. "We're heading out for the weekend," she said brightly. "Just a quick trip upstate with some friends." Ryan nodded. "Back Sunday night." The information was delivered so casually it almost sounded like an afterthought. Melissa placed the towels in a laundry basket and added, "You're welcome to stay here and relax while we're gone. The house is yours." The phrase hung quietly in the air for a moment. "The house is yours." Ryan grabbed his car keys from the counter. "If you need anything, just call," he said. "I'll be fine." Within an hour, they were gone. I watched their car disappear down the quiet street from the living room window. The neighborhood was peaceful again, sunlight filtering through the tall trees that lined the sidewalks. For the first time since arriving in Greenwich, I was completely alone in the house. The silence felt different now, not uncomfortable, just clear. I made myself a cup of tea and carried it to the patio. The backyard was beautifully maintained, fresh grass, trimmed hedges, a small wooden table surrounded by neatly arranged chairs. Ryan and Melissa had built a pleasant life here. That much was obvious. But as I sat there looking back at the house, something occurred to me. For 2 years, Ryan had believed the structure of ownership didn't really matter. He had told his neighbors a simpler story, one where he had built this life entirely on his own. And perhaps that story had become comfortable, but comfort and legality are rarely the same thing. After finishing my tea, I went back inside. The house remained exactly as they had left it, clean, organized, perfectly arranged. I walked slowly through each room again. The living room, the kitchen, the hallway lined with framed photographs that carefully documented Ryan's life here in Greenwich. Still no childhood pictures, still no trace of the life that had come before. I paused briefly near the small desk where the property documents were stored. Then I returned to the patio with my phone. The number I dialed belonged to David Rosen's office. He answered on the third ring. Rosen and Feldman Estate Law. David, it's Barbara Collins. Barbara? He said warmly. I just reviewed your email this morning. Everything appears exactly as it was originally filed. Yes, I replied calmly. That's what I wanted to confirm. There was a brief pause. Is there a particular reason you're revisiting the documents now? He asked carefully. I looked across the backyard toward the quiet street beyond the fence. My son seems to have developed a slightly different understanding of the situation. David chuckled softly. That happens more often than people realize. I'm not interested in causing problems, I continued, but I do want to understand my options. His tone shifted slightly into the measured cadence lawyers often use when explaining legal matters. Well, Barbara, since the deed lists you as the property owner, the legal authority over the house ultimately remains with you. The mortgage arrangement your son holds doesn't change that. I nodded slowly, even though he couldn't see me. That's what I thought. If you wanted to restructure the ownership, he added, that's something we could certainly explore. There are several legal mechanisms that would allow you to adjust the arrangement. I rested my arm on the patio table, considering his words. What would that involve? We could prepare new documentation transferring or reassigning the property ownership. It would simply require your authorization and proper filing with the county. The process sounded almost surprisingly straightforward. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then David added gently, May I ask what outcome you're hoping for? I watched a pair of birds land briefly on the backyard fence before flying off again. I haven't decided yet, I said. That's perfectly reasonable, he replied. We can take things one step at a time. I thanked him for his time and ended the call. The phone rested quietly in my hand as I sat there on the patio. Inside the house, everything remained calm and orderly. Ryan and Melissa were several hours away by now, enjoying their weekend trip with friends, and for the first time since arriving in Greenwich, I had a clear understanding of exactly where I stood, not just emotionally, legally. The story Ryan had been telling his neighbors might have been simple, but the truth about the house was something else entirely, and now that truth was no longer sitting quietly in a folder on a desk, it had entered the conversation. The rest of Saturday passed slowly. Without Ryan and Melissa in the house, the rooms felt larger, somehow quieter. The polished floors carried the soft echo of my footsteps as I moved from one room to another, noticing details that had escaped my attention before. A stack of real estate magazines on the coffee table, a set of decorative bowls on the kitchen counter that looked too perfect to ever actually be used. A framed photograph from Ryan and Melissa's wedding day. In that picture, Ryan looked proud standing beside his new wife in front of a white garden arch. Guests surrounded them, smiling toward the camera. I studied the photograph for a moment. Then I set it back down exactly where it had been. Later that afternoon, David Rosen called again. Barbara, he said after I answered, I've reviewed the original documents in more detail. I stepped outside onto the patio again, the warm air carrying the distant sound of children playing somewhere down the street. And I asked calmly, "Your ownership rights are very clear," David replied. "The property deed places full legal control of the house with you. The mortgage agreement under Ryan's name doesn't change that. I already knew this. But hearing the words spoken aloud made the reality feel more concrete. If you'd like to move forward with restructuring the ownership," David continued, "I've prepared a preliminary reassignment document." I leaned back in the patio chair. How quickly could something like that be finalized? "Quite quickly, actually," he said. "Once you sign the paperwork, we simply file the new documentation with the county. The process itself is straightforward." A light breeze moved through the trees behind the house. For a moment, I closed my eyes and listened to the quiet rhythm of the neighborhood. Children riding bicycles, a car passing slowly down the street, someone watering plants in a nearby yard, all the ordinary sounds of a peaceful suburban afternoon. "Send it to me," I said finally. David didn't ask any further questions. "I'll have the documents ready shortly," he replied. An hour later, my phone chimed with a new email. Attached to the message were several pages of legal forms. Property reassignment documentation. I carried the phone inside and sat down at the kitchen desk where I had first found the original deed. The overhead light illuminated the papers clearly as I opened the files. The language was familiar. Legal descriptions of the property, ownership clauses, authorization sections waiting for a signature. The new document established a revised structure for the house, one that removed any ambiguity about who ultimately controlled the property. I read through the pages carefully. David had always been meticulous. Everything was precise, everything was legal, everything was entirely within my rights. For a long moment, I sat there, the quiet house around me almost perfectly still. Then my phone rang again. "David, I just wanted to confirm you received the documents," he said. "Yes. And you understand the effect of signing them?" "I do. If you authorize the reassignment, the filing will update the county records immediately." I glanced around the kitchen. Ryan's house, or at least the house he believed was his, the same house where only yesterday he had introduced me as a visiting friend. "I understand," I said softly. There was a brief pause on the line. David spoke again, his voice measured but kind. "Barbara, I want to make sure you're comfortable with this decision." "I am." I ended the call. Then I placed the phone on the desk and looked down at the documents again. For 2 years, I had allowed Ryan's version of the story to continue without correction. Perhaps because it seemed easier. Perhaps because I believed the truth would eventually speak for itself. But something about the way he had stood in that living room the day before, smiling easily as he erased my place in his life, had shifted something inside me. Not anger, just clarity. I printed the documents using the small wireless printer beside the desk. The pages slid out one by one, the faint mechanical hum filling the quiet kitchen. When the final sheet appeared, I gathered them carefully into a neat stack. The signature line waited at the bottom of the last page. I picked up a pen. For a moment, I hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of respect for the weight of the decision. Then I signed, Barbara Collins. The ink settled into the paper with quiet finality. I scanned the signed pages and sent them back to David. A few minutes later, my phone chimed again. Received his message read, "I'll file the documentation with the county shortly." I placed the phone down and walked slowly toward the living room window. Outside, the street remained peaceful, the late afternoon sunlight stretching across the lawns of the neighboring houses. Ryan and Melissa were still away with their friends. They had no reason to imagine that anything had changed, but somewhere in the Greenwich Land Records office, new paperwork was already moving quietly through the system. And by the time Ryan returned home the next evening, the story he had been telling everyone about this house would no longer match the one written in the official records. Sunday morning arrived quietly. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the living room, casting long reflections across the hardwood floor. The neighborhood outside was peaceful, in the soft way Sunday mornings often are, cars moving slowly, the occasional distant sound of someone walking a dog along the sidewalk. Inside the house, everything remained exactly as it had been the day before. Ryan and Melissa's coats still hung near the entryway. The decorative bowls on the kitchen counter remained untouched. The framed photographs along the hallway continued to tell the same carefully edited version of Ryan's life. I made myself a cup of coffee and carried it to the kitchen table. For the first time since arriving in Greenwich, the house felt less like someone else's home and more like a quiet place I had permission to move through slowly. There was no urgency in anything I did that morning. I washed the single mug I had used for tea the night before. I opened the back door and let fresh air move through the kitchen for a while. I walked once more through the living room, pausing briefly near the bookshelf Ryan had proudly shown the neighbors. Everything looked exactly as they had arranged it. Nothing had changed on the surface, but beneath the surface something very important had. My phone vibrated softly against the kitchen table. A new message from David Rosen. I opened the email. Barbara. The reassignment documents have been filed with the Greenwich Land Records Office. The updated ownership record is now officially registered. I read the message again slowly. The legal transfer was complete. Somewhere in the county database, the official story of the house had just been rewritten. I set the phone down and sat quietly for a moment, letting the reality of that settle. There was no triumph in the feeling, no sense of revenge, just a calm recognition that the structure of things had returned to what it had always been. After finishing my coffee, I stood and walked to the small desk near the laundry room, the same desk where I had first discovered the property folder. I opened the drawer and removed a blank sheet of paper. For a moment, I simply held the pen in my hand, considering what should be said. Some conversations require long explanations. Others need only a few honest lines. I began writing. Ryan, I imagine you'll notice that a few things regarding the house have changed since you left for the weekend. I paused briefly, choosing my next words carefully. The property paperwork has been reviewed and updated with the county. Everything is now aligned with the original legal structure we agreed on when the house was purchased. I looked at the words for a moment before continuing. I hope the home continues to be a place where you build the life you've been working toward. Then I added one final line. But the truth about how it came to exist here deserves to remain part of that story. I folded the paper neatly, then I placed it on the kitchen counter where Ryan would see it the moment he walked in. The house remained perfectly still around me. Outside, a few clouds had begun to gather across the afternoon sky. I walked slowly through the living room one last time, past the photographs, past the carefully arranged furniture, past the window where sunlight still stretched across the quiet street. Ryan and Melissa would be driving back soon. Their weekend trip would end the way most ordinary weekends do, tired but relaxed, expecting everything at home to be exactly the way they left it. And in many ways it would be. The furniture would still be in the same place. The neighbors would still wave from their driveways. The street would remain peaceful. But the legal foundation of the house, the part Ryan had quietly chosen to ignore, had shifted back into the light. I picked up my bag from the guest room and brought it downstairs. My flight back to Oregon wasn't until the following morning, but I had already arranged a room at a small hotel near the airport for the night. It felt simpler that way. As I reached the front door, my phone vibrated once more. Another email from David. Confirmation attached, the message read. I opened the document. The updated county filing appeared clearly on the screen. Property address, recording date, ownership record, and beneath it the name listed in the official line of authority, Barbara Collins. I closed the phone slowly. Then I stepped outside into the quiet Greenwich afternoon, gently pulling the door closed behind me. By the time Ryan returned home later that evening, the house would still look exactly the same. But the story behind it would finally be impossible to ignore. Ryan and Melissa returned just after sunset. The quiet Greenwich street had already begun settling into the slower rhythm of Sunday evening. Porch lights flickered on one by one along the neighboring houses, and somewhere nearby a television played faintly through an open window. Ryan's car turned slowly into the driveway. From the outside, the house looked exactly the same as when they had left 2 days earlier. The front porch light glowed softly above the door. The curtains hung neatly in the living room windows. Nothing about the place suggested that anything unusual had happened over the weekend. Ryan stepped out of the car first, stretching slightly after the drive. That trip went fast, he said. Melissa closed the passenger door and grabbed her bag from the back seat. It always does. Ryan unlocked the front door and pushed it open. The house greeted them with the same quiet stillness they had left behind. Ryan dropped his keys onto the console table near the entryway and glanced around the living room. "Mom must still be upstairs," he said casually. Melissa slipped off her shoes and walked toward the kitchen. "She might have gone out," she replied. "It's pretty quiet." Ryan shrugged and followed her. As soon as they entered the kitchen, Melissa stopped. "There's a note here," she said. Ryan looked up. The folded sheet of paper sat neatly on the counter. He picked it up without much concern and unfolded it. At first, his expression remained neutral. Then his brow tightened slightly as he continued reading. Melissa leaned against the counter. "What is it?" Ryan didn't answer right away. He read the note a second time, slower this time. Then he placed it down carefully on the counter. "What does it say?" Melissa asked again. Ryan ran a hand across the back of his neck. "It's from Mom." Melissa waited. Ryan exhaled quietly. "She says the property paperwork has been reviewed." Melissa frowned. "What does that mean?" Ryan reached for his phone. "I don't know." He opened his email, scrolling through the screen quickly. There was a new message waiting, a forwarded document. Ryan tapped it open. The file loaded slowly. When it finally appeared, the first thing Ryan noticed was the official header from the Greenwich Land Records Office. Below it was the updated filing record. Ryan's eyes moved down the page. Property address, recording date, ownership structure. Then the line that made him stop. Owner of record. Barbara Collins. Ryan stared at the screen for a long moment. The words seemed strangely still against the white background of the document. Barbara Collins. His eyes moved back to the top of the page, then down again, as if reading it a second time might somehow change the line he had just seen. But it didn't. A memory surfaced quietly in his mind. 2 years earlier, a small conference room in a closing office, papers spread across a table. The lawyer explaining the structure of the purchase. "This simply keeps the property secure," his mother had said, calmly. Ryan had barely looked up from the documents then. "That's fine," he had replied. "We'll handle the mortgage." At the time, it had felt like a small technical detail. Now, standing in the kitchen of the house he thought he owned, Ryan realized something unsettling. It had never been a small detail at all. Ryan stared at the screen. Melissa stepped closer. "What is it?" Ryan handed her the phone. Melissa read the document silently. Then she looked up. "What is this?" Ryan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned and walked slowly toward the living room window. Outside, the streetlights had begun glowing along the sidewalk. Neighbors were finishing their evening walks. Everything looked perfectly normal. But something inside Ryan's mind was beginning to shift. "Ryan," Melissa said again. He spoke quietly. "The deed." Melissa blinked. "What about it?" Ryan rested his hands on the back of the sofa. "When we bought the house, Mom helped with the down payment." Melissa frowned. "You told me that." "Yes." Ryan's voice remained calm, but there was a heaviness underneath it now. "She insisted her name stay on the property deed." Melissa looked back at the document. "But the mortgage is in your name?" Ryan nodded. "Yes." The realization was settling slowly now, like a puzzle finally revealing its picture. Melissa looked confused. "So what does this mean?" Ryan didn't answer right away. Instead, he picked up the note Barbara had left on the counter and read it again. "The property paperwork has been reviewed and updated with the county. Everything is now aligned with the original legal structure." Ryan lowered the paper. For the first time since walking into the house, he looked genuinely unsettled. "She didn't change anything," he said quietly. Melissa frowned. "Then why send this?" Ryan stared toward the hallway where the framed photographs lined the wall. because suddenly he understood something. The paperwork had never been wrong, the story had. And suddenly the house behind him felt very different. Melissa folded her arms. "So your mother owns the house?" Ryan took a slow breath. "Legally, yes." The word hung unspoken between them. Melissa looked around the kitchen as if seeing the space differently now. The polished counters, the carefully arranged shelves, the house that had felt so secure only hours earlier. Ryan picked up his keys again. "I need some air." Without waiting for a response, he stepped outside. The evening air was cool against his face as he walked across the backyard and lowered himself into one of the patio chairs. The same chair Barbara had been sitting in the day before. For a long time, Ryan didn't move. He simply looked at the house. The windows glowed warmly in the dark. The backyard lights illuminated the fence and the quiet trees beyond. Everything about the scene felt calm, but Ryan's thoughts were anything but calm. He remembered the conversation 2 years earlier, standing outside the house with Barbara after dinner. "I just don't want people thinking I still rely on my mother." At the time, the sentence had seemed harmless, just a small piece of pride. Now it sounded different in his memory, because somewhere along the way that pride had turned into something else. Ryan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The quiet street beyond the fence looked exactly the same as it had every other night since they moved here, but the house behind him suddenly felt heavier. Not because it had changed, because he had finally realized what it had always been. And more importantly, who had made it possible in the first place. A week later, the rain had returned to Salem. Not the heavy kind that arrives with thunder and wind, but the soft, steady drizzle that settles quietly over the trees and rooftops for hours at a time. I stood near the kitchen window of my house, watching the gray sky hang low over the street, the same street Ryan had once ridden his bicycle down when he was 8 years old. The world here felt slower than Greenwich. Quieter. Perhaps that was why I had always liked it. My phone buzzed softly on the counter beside me, a message from David Rosen. I dried my hands on a towel and opened the email. "Barbara, the final documents for the Collins Family Living Trust are ready for your signature. Once filed, the property in Greenwich will be placed under the trust with Sophie Collins listed as the beneficiary as you requested." I read the message twice. The decision had come to me 2 days after returning home, not out of anger, not even out of disappointment, just clarity. Ryan had wanted independence. He had wanted the world to believe he had built his life without leaning on anyone. In a way, I could understand that. But the house itself had never really been about Ryan or me. It had always been about the future, about the family that would come after. And Sophie, my granddaughter, deserved to inherit something honest, something real. I signed the documents electronically and sent them back to David. A few minutes later, my phone rang. "Ryan." For a moment, I simply looked at the screen before answering. "Hello?" There was a brief silence on the other end. Then Ryan spoke. "Mom." His voice sounded different than it had the week before. Quieter. "How was the flight home?" he asked. "It was fine." Another pause followed. Ryan cleared his throat slightly. "I read the paperwork you left. I assumed you would." The rain tapped softly against the window. I didn't realize Ryan said slowly that the ownership was still structured like that. "You did," I replied gently. "You just hadn't thought about it in a while." He didn't argue. I guess I stopped paying attention to the details. That sounded more honest. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Ryan said something that surprised me. "The neighbors asked about you." I smiled faintly. "What did you tell them that you're my mother?" The words hung quietly in the space between us. And I asked. Ryan exhaled. "And that you helped us buy the house." I looked out the window again. The rain had grown slightly heavier now, streaking the glass in long, thin lines. "That sounds accurate," I said. Ryan let out a small, nervous laugh. "Yeah." Another quiet moment passed. Finally, he spoke again. "Melissa and I talked a lot this week about the way things looked from your side." I didn't interrupt. Ryan continued. "I think I got caught up trying to prove something. What were you trying to prove, that I could build a life on my own? I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. That's a natural thing for a son to want, I know, Ryan said, but I think somewhere along the way I forgot that building something on your own doesn't mean pretending no one helped you. His voice softened slightly. I'm sorry, Mom. The apology wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rehearsed, just quiet. And somehow that made it feel real. Thank you for saying that, I replied. Ryan hesitated again before speaking. I also wanted to ask you something. What is it? The house. What happens now? I walked slowly toward the kitchen table and sat down. I placed it into a family trust this morning. Ryan seemed surprised. A trust? Yes. For Sophie. The silence on the phone stretched longer this time. She'll inherit it one day, I explained calmly. Ryan spoke slowly. You didn't keep it for yourself. I never wanted the house for myself. Another pause. Then Ryan said quietly, That makes sense. The conversation shifted after that. We talked about small things, Sophie's school, Ryan's work, the neighborhood barbecue he mentioned the week before. Eventually, Ryan said he should get back to work. Mom. Yes, I'm glad you came to visit. So am I. We ended the call there. I placed the phone on the table and sat quietly for a moment. Outside, the rain had begun to slow. A pale stripe of light appeared behind the clouds as the afternoon sky started to clear. Somewhere down the street, a car door slammed, followed by the distant sound of children laughing. Life moving forward the way it always does. The house in Greenwich would still stand on its quiet street. Ryan and Melissa would continue building their lives there. Neighbors would still stop by with bottles of wine and stories about weekend plans. And one day, many years from now, Sophie would grow up and learn the real story behind the place she inherited. Not a story about revenge, just one about truth. Because sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is simply allow the truth to stand quietly where it belongs. And as I watched the rain fade into a soft gray afternoon, I realized something simple. Families don't become stronger by pretending the past never happened. They become stronger when they remember who helped build the foundation in the first place. Before we finish, I want to ask you something. If you were in Barbara's place, would you have done the same thing? Would you have corrected the story quietly the way she did? Or would you have confronted Ryan directly? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if this story made you reflect on family honesty and respect, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who might understand the message, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. As for me, I still believe that the most powerful truths in a family are often the quiet ones no one can erase.